Welcome back to Aspen Ideas Reset. Yesterday, we talked about creating an economy that encourages every American to participate and thrive. Today, we'll talk about the health of that economy itself and just how sustainable it is over the long term. We've built a powerhouse of an economy based on exploiting natural resources and ignoring the consequences. We're running out of the former, and we can't run from the latter. The Biden administration wants to put us on the road to a net zero economy by the middle of the century. That's going to need immediate action and strong support from business and the public. Done right, it's all upside, but we've got to start now. In the next hour, we'll hear about the top priority climate policies coming out of the White House and Congress, talk about the tech we already have that can help us achieve carbon neutrality, and have other energy-filled discussions. After that, we invite you to tackle some of the myths of getting to carbon neutral in an interactive workshop and to a talk with economist Mariana Mazzucato about her new book, Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. I'm Scarlett Fu with Bloomberg Television.
And I am Joanna Smith-Romani with the Aspen Institute. Thank you for joining Aspen Ideas Reset. We'll start by welcoming Gina McCarthy, White House National Climate Advisor. While there's a lot the Biden administration can do to move us to net zero, for long-term and durable solutions, he'll need legislative buy-in. What does he achieve in 4 years to give sustainability the momentum it needs?
Hello, I'm Leslie Kaufman. I'm a senior climate change reporter with Bloomberg Green. I'm here today with Gina McCarthy, who has a very important task. She's running climate change policy for the Biden White House. Gina, everyone knows that Biden came in with a very ambitious agenda, which includes a carbon-free grid by 2035 and a net zero economy by 2050. But once you get into office, that's a lot to do. I'm hoping you can run through it with us, just a few of the things you're trying to do in the very short term. What are some of the quick things you're trying to get done as you take office?
Well, Leslie, first, thanks for letting me be here and with you, and also tell you how I miss not being in Aspen with you. But it's great to be here, and I thank everybody for joining because these issues are hard to get your head around, but so vital to our ability to live safe, healthy lives. So, one of the reasons why I joined President Biden was because he had a plan that was really aggressive. He didn't come in here and then start scratching his head and saying, well, what do we do about climate change? I had my marching orders before I took the job. And so that's why his explicit call that climate change action happen at a level and a breadth that science demands, which was what was really appealing to me. But in many ways, Leslie, it was more his personal touch about this, his understanding that it's time to be hopeful again. He's been very aggressive in getting out in front of COVID, but also saying what comes next. And that next is we have to rebuild our economy. And he sees the climate issue as being entirely relevant to that question. He wants it to be a clean energy economy that's going to grow good paying jobs, accessible to unions, help with that transition that we have to make, and help deliver the promises that we have made to the environmental justice community that we're going to invest in them again. And so I am excited to be here because he didn't come with a blank slate. He came with a plan, and it's my job to deliver it.
That's terrific, but as we spoke about, it's an incredibly ambitious plan. He came in, he signed some executive orders, which is very exciting. The Climate Task Force has now met. That's over a score of agencies. I've understand you've listed some priorities for EPA, which include methane and autos. I'm hoping you could just give us a few more of those priorities as we look out across all the different things you need to get done. What are some of the things you're going to get done in the short term?
At a higher level, it's all about the entire federal government. It's about moving away from the idea that my old agency, EPA, is like the sole purveyor of the issue of climate change and how to fix it. It's not. And so President Biden really created this domestic climate office in my position as a way to say every part of the federal government has to be engaged in the issue of climate change, because every part not is actually contributing to the challenge of climate change. And so it's all about a whole of government approach so that everybody is looking at their programs and their policies to make sure we're not funneling money to the fossil fuel industry, but thinking instead about the jobs of today and tomorrow and where we need to be. And one of the most important things that we can bring to the table is our ability to actually procure products and services in a way that's going to jumpstart a clean energy economy and send the kind of market-based signals where the private sector will say, aha, so we have lots of electric vehicles being purchased by the United States of America, thousands of them that they might buy every year. Maybe I can edge up to making that 2035 idea that we're going to go all electric that GM announced, something that will be good for everybody. And really, Leslie, we've lost so much time with all the rollbacks of the past 4 or 5 years and the climate denial, both in terms of our credibility domestically, but internationally, that the great thing is that my partner in crime on this is Secretary John Kerry, who is now the envoy that's dealing with the international world. Because we don't just have to get great domestically. We have to get great in terms of providing leadership internationally. We're just not manufacturing at the levels we need. We're not grabbing the economy of the future. We're ceding it to China and other countries, and we need to get that back.
So let's talk about what happened in this country last week in terms of the cold snap and the incredible stress it put on the electric grid. That was interesting because it showed the weakness of America's electric grid, which I wonder whether you're going to be addressing. But it also showed some of the politics you're up against. You were immediately attacked by the fossil fuel industry for focusing too much on renewables. And this also leads to a question of how much are you talking to the fossil fuel industry and consulting them as you move forward?
Yeah, yeah. Well, certainly we're talking to everybody who has some words of wisdom to share and ideas on the table, because part of this is about making sure that it's an open and transparent public process about what we do. The issue in Texas seemed to be a surprise to everybody when we know that climate change is not just creating heat waves, it's creating challenges at both extremes. So now we're seeing record temperatures in Texas, but it wasn't too long ago that they had similar challenges with their grid. And maybe a decade or so ago. And so what we need to do is make sure that our grid is resilient. And we have to fill the gaps in our transmission so that renewable energy can thrive all across the United States. You know, people may not realize it, but in 2020, we had tremendous amount of growth in both solar and wind, and that was because it's cheaper. It's competing effectively. What happened in Texas was not a failure of renewable energy. It was not a sign that more renewable energy is bad for you or provides instability. Just the opposite. It was the fact that they had not invested in their own systems of refineries to be able to keep them functioning. And they did not have a grid that connected Texas with other states in a way that other states are aligned together to make sure that we're relying on one another as a country. So it made the response to that much more difficult. You know, if renewable energy we know is competitive and it's cheaper, and that doesn't matter if you're in a Democratic state or a Republican state. It only matters because we know that it's essential for a clean, healthy, and productive future, but it's also essential today to keep costs down. And so we're going to keep pushing in terms of clean energy and looking at that as the biggest opportunity we have for a stable economic recovery, but one that also grows lots and lots of jobs.
While these goals of getting to a clean grid by 2035 and a net zero economy by 2050 are short, they're also long in some sense. They're still 15 years off, and you're only in office for 4 years. If we were going to look at you at the end of 4 years and say, what are the metrics, what are the milestones that need to be accomplished to know that you guys really moved the ball, what would we look at?
You know, Leslie, I think the whole trick to this is to recognize that envisioning how you get to net zero in 2050 is a difficult task because there's so many years in which innovation is going to happen. So what we need to recognize that even with the Clean Power Plan that I put out to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector when I was EPA administrator, that didn't take more than a week for the Supreme Court or something to stay that rule, right? But nevertheless, it sent a market signal that was undeniable. And we have moved far faster than we ever would have regulated. And so we have to look at this as an opportunity right now for us to develop a nationally determined contribution, which is our way of telling the international community, now that we've rejoined Paris, what we intend to achieve for reductions by 2030. And we're going to deliver that to send a signal about how we get to a strong NDC number in 2030 that puts us on that pathway to 2050 net zero. So you're going to have lots of opportunity to make a judgment in April about how aggressive we're going to be, about all the analytics that underpin it, that looks at transportation, housing, the power sector, the building sector, and what we think we can do as a country moving forward. So I think you'll have plenty to judge. We have plenty that we're going to move out and do, lots more executive orders to actually roll out, lots more opportunities for public discussion, and lots of jobs that we're going to create.
That's terrific. I just do want to add one. Does that mean we're going to have clear metrics? You're publishing clear metrics in April that will let us know what, for instance, where you'll be in transportation, where you'll be in electric generation?
Yes. We have a 2030 goal, and we'll be able to underpin it in each of those sectors to tell you what we think is happening in those sectors now, how our investment and our standards are going to push that forward. We'll have opportunities to work with states and cities to get their take on what beyond the federal is going to happen. And we're all going to stand together in Glasgow in November, and we're going to make the United States a proud country again in that forum.
Well, terrific. Gina, thank you so much for your time. I know you've been incredibly busy, and this is an incredibly busy time. So myself and Aspen really thanks you for taking the time to explain this all to us.
Aspen Ideas Reset is generously underwritten by MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, PayPal, and Prudential.
Up next, a story from someone who is making change in their community today.
My name is Steph Spears, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Solstice. So the problem in America is that 80% of people cannot put solar on their own rooftop, and it's a ton of reasons why. They're renters, they're condo owners, they're low income, there's a tree covering their roof is facing the wrong way. So for all of these people that cannot put solar on their own rooftop, we offer them something called community solar. So community solar means you don't have to worry about installing anything on your rooftop. You can buy a portion of a shared solar farm and switch to solar that way. Generally, it's a subscription model, so you're not paying anything up front. You just pay for the power that's produced by your portion, and the electricity from the farm goes back to the grid, and you see a credit show up on your monthly utility bill for the solar that you're enjoying virtually. So one way to think of it is it's a community garden, but for solar. There are a lot of points of friction when signing up for solar right now, and Solstice's mission is to decrease all the friction and making it easy for people to sign up within a few minutes, not hours or months. I was raised by a single mom who struggled to pay the bills every year, including the electricity bill, and it was often a choice between what bills do we pay in what month. And this is an opportunity for people to save money on their electricity bills without putting any money up front. It's really the only accessible way most of us can go solar. And so it's such a worthwhile mission, and we need a lot more people working in this space to make it accessible to everyone. But Solstice is a good start.
Up next, let's talk about the private sector's role. Consumers, shareholders, and stakeholders are demanding climate action like never before. But the investment requirements are huge, although so are the returns. Jim Coulter, CEO of TPG Capital, talks about the challenges of rewiring our economy for sustainability.
Hello, I'm Ed Hammond, Bloomberg Senior Deals Reporter in New York, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Jim Coulter, the co-CEO and co-founder of TPG, and also the person responsible for leading the firm's Rise climate strategy. Jim, great to have you with us. Let's start with this. You've talked about us being at a tipping point for the way climate and ESG investing is being done. Explain that to me a little bit.
Ed, for almost decades now, we've been talking about the why of impact investing and climate investing. We've finally moved to the how and the now of it. Why now? For decades, we've been thinking about the environmental issues, but now the business engine has begun. And it's the culmination of four forces hitting us at this moment. Let me walk through them quickly. First of all, we moved from government net zero to corporate net zero. It's fascinating. You can't talk about the next quarter in a corporation, but you can talk about your climate plans 20 years out, and CEOs have gone for it. Second force is consumers now get it. 55% of CPG product growth is in sustainable products. Customers want to express their climate preferences in the products they buy. The third thing is investors now care. Whether it's Larry Fink or the Canadian pension plans, investors are saying we want our capital deployed into climate solutions. And most important, and this is the one that's driving a lot of our activity at, is that the technology has changed. Battery costs down 90%, wind and solar now at grid parity in 60 to 70% of markets. We're at a point where investing, which people used to think of as concessionary, is now actually done without government intervention. And that's allowing the flywheel to get going.
It's interesting you touched there on the way tech has enabled a lot of this. Obviously, you yourself sat through the technology or digital revolution, invested heavily at the time, some very successful investments at the time. I'm interested how you see this as compared to that, and also where we are at the moment of revolution in this green wave.
It's a great analogy, Ed. In my investing career, I've been lucky to be part of two super cycles, the interest rate super cycle and the digital revolution. I firmly believe that the climate revolution will be the third one. So what can we learn from the digital revolution? First of all, it will affect everything. Every company will have to have a climate plan, just as they had a digital plan. There is no place to hide from this revolution. Secondly, it will not be predictable. I've always thought technology moves in unpredictable ways. We put men on the moon before we put wheels on suitcases. Think about that for a minute. In the early days of technology, we were talking about home pages and data centers, and now we're talking about 5G and TikTok. Totally unexpected. And so we're going to see a revolution that began with Netscape and maybe is beginning with Tesla and ended with things like Salesforce and Facebook. And we don't know the companies that are going to be created yet in this revolution, but they're going to be exciting. In terms of what's different about this one, though, because we have to make sure not to look too much into history, is this will take massively amounts more capital. Because one of the things that was unique to the digital revolution is that you could come up with an idea and just put it out there on the rails of the internet. This is a physical revolution. Think about Mary Barra talking about changing the entire production of GM to electric vehicles. The amount of capital employed dwarfs the amount of capital that was required to build Facebook. So there's some analogies and there's some differences, but I can tell you it is exciting and it's happening now.
And that's a really interesting point, because that sort of wraps together the two themes you just discussed, which really are, for this to work, capitalism has to be behind it for economic reasons as well as altruistic reasons. So where does that capital come from? What form does it take? And I suppose at this point, where is it on the risk curve in terms of its appetite to be investing in the space?
I think we're just beginning to form the capital market and private market solutions around this revolution. So I view this as two sides of the same coin, Ed. On one side, there's a huge societal need. On the other side, there is an opportunity to solve that, which should be very profitable. The two sides of the coins actually flip together. If we can create profitable investments, not concessionary, but profitable, it will drive more capital, which would accelerate the solutions. So the capital market has to move out of philanthropy and concessionary returns with government supports into an out and out search for innovation, capitalism, and profits. And if those profits are developed, and you certainly see that in the stock market today with anything climate related, it will draw more capital and will draw more innovation. The odd part at the moment is the market is set up in something I haven't quite seen before. On one side, there has been a lot of discussion of clean tech. And perhaps playing off the digital revolution, there was venture capital that got there early. On the other side, there's contracted renewables, which are infrastructure assets. What's been missing is the middle of the market, which is the building of the great climate companies of tomorrow. And that's an area for private equity, and it's an area where the tools of investing and physical investing are going to come into play. And that's an area that we're very focused on at this moment.
Well, when you're looking at investing and where to put those dollars, I mean, there are some sectors that are obvious performers already in this space, electric vehicles probably being foremost among them right now. But what are the big drivers going to be when you're thinking about, as I say, where to deploy those dollars?
I think generally people are thinking about the climate revolution much too narrowly today. It's like the early days of technology when people talked about hardware and software. We've gone into this deeply. There's about 70 different subsectors that we're mapping that affect everything from materials to carbon capture, all of which are developing along technological and economic curves. But to simplify that, we're really approaching the market in 5 pieces. The first is clean energy, which is a remaking of the grid. We're watching it this week in Texas, Ed. We have gone from a single one-way unidimensional on-demand power grid to a distributed grid. And that creates both opportunities for solar and wind, and it creates massive chaos because it's much more complicated to manage. The second area that we're interested in is clean transportation, which right now there's a lot of focus on electric vehicles and on Tesla, but might Tesla be the Netscape or AOL? Are there a lot more companies to come? If you go back to Detroit in the 1920s, there were 150 car companies in Detroit. They worked their way down to 3. It's starting with the electrification of the car and system. It's moving to charging stations, and ultimately it may end up in hydrogen. Massive 30-year play. Third area we're looking at greening industrials. Every type of industrial is going to have to change. We've created a steel mill with 90% less carbon footprint. It's a LEED certified steel mill. We're looking at plastics that are carbon negative. The entire brown industries are going to have to move to green or khaki, and massive capital will be required to do that. Fourth area that we're looking at are natural solutions and agriculture. Agriculture has a huge part of the emissions footprint, and it's distributed and needs substantial help to change that. And the final point is really a lot around what we call enabling solutions. This is the picks and the shovels. Like, how is this going to happen? So, for example, there have been 1,500 net zero pledges. As I said, corporations are on this. But to do that, there's not a clear pathway. So we've invested in one of the largest producers of carbon credits, because that market is obviously going to explode and complexify as we move through it. We're doing big data for power grid management. We're doing services for energy efficiency across the US. So this idea of driving forward climate, not as an individual activity, but as an economic sector, is something that the financial world and the investing world is going to have to engage in.
Jim, let's just end on this before it gets to that point where it is, as you say, sort of a viable economic sector in its own right. There is still the need for hope. People need to hope that this is something that can be achieved. So let me ask you, when you're looking out at this market today, what gives you hope about now, and what is feeding into it right now that it will get to that point, that in 5 years you and I might be sitting here having this conversation and it will be the norm? It will no longer be something we're talking about in theoreticals.
The hope for me is that we have moved beyond the why, and we are clearly engaged in the area that business is good at, which is the how. And why I see particular hope, and I'm really dedicating a lot of my activity to this area, Ed, is that the top down and bottoms up are resetting together. Top down, customers, governments, CEOs, investors, they are requiring attention to this issue. But bottoms up, as I go to work every day and look at the entrepreneurs who are resetting these companies, the ideas and technologies which have been brewing for years, and in some cases decades, they're coming together at a moment in time. And literally, it's accelerating on a daily basis. So I think a lot of people are looking at it top down, but as I sit within the ecosystem that is TPG, 250 companies, huge pipeline of opportunities, it's there, it's happening, it's exciting, and it's a reset.
Jim, fantastic. Hopefully next time we'll talk, it will be, as you say, the norm. Jim Coulter, thank you so much.
Let's now hear from some voices across America about their thoughts and personal experiences with today's topic.
You know, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord was a good start.
Besides leaving alone like indigenous land, besides not tapping into oil, there's a lot. I don't really know where to start.
Climate change, no, I felt the impacts of pollution. I was living in India for a while, in Delhi, and living in Delhi at least in November, like in the period between November and December, which is when farmers in India burned their remaining crops. Delhi in general is so polluted, but during that period, every day is equivalent to smoking a pack of cigarettes for the average individual.
There are some changes I've made in my lifestyle to be more sustainable. One being trying to cut out fast fashion, because that is a large contributor to climate change. But it is hard in today's society because fast fashion is cheaper, and everything that is worse for the environment is usually cheaper.
We do have a hybrid car. We live in a place where we can walk to the grocery store, we can walk to places that we want to go to, the gym, the library. So trying to like reduce our footprint in that way. We try to buy locally, we garden, we thrift. So I think those are small everyday actions, but they can have a big impact on both the local economy and sort of our carbon footprint.
Yeah, I would say the most sustainable thing I can be is cautious of my spending, right? There are obviously the things that your neighborhood or your community kind of enforces, things like recycling, in that manner. But for me personally, I think your spending will trickle down to your trash, right? What you spend your money on is going to equate to what's going to be in your trash.
I would say the U.S. is probably doing a really bad job with climate change. I don't know if that's necessarily going to change anytime soon just because of everything going on, but I would say that we could be doing a lot better than we are.
We have to figure out how to maintain like a solid earth. Like I'm scared for the future of kids and grandkids and things like that. So I'll leave that to the scientists how we can get there, but whatever they suggest, I'm willing to take part in.
And now let's see what the data has to say.
Hi there, I'm Matt Bullard. I'm the Chief Content Officer at Bloomberg NEF. And today I'm here to talk about the concept of a reset. And I want to begin with a reset that we've already got in a way, which is that due to the pandemic, U.S. greenhouse gas emissions have fallen 9% in 2020 from a year earlier, which is really unprecedented in our economic history. And it gives us the opportunity to actually meet the targets of the Paris Agreement doing what we're doing now. But I think that there's room for us to go much further. And in order to do that, we're going to drive it through a couple of things. And the first of those things is companies. So companies around the world, but especially in the United States, have now been signing lots of agreements to directly procure clean energy. We see this because it helps companies not only power their operations, but it helps multiple bottom lines. The United States is the biggest of these markets. Amazon last year signed 35 different agreements for 5 gigawatts of clean power. But in order to make this stuff happen, we need to add another layer to that reset, and that is capital. When I talk about capital, I'm thinking here about green finance. So the US green finance market didn't really exist a decade ago. Last year, it was about $100 billion worth of green bonds and green loans, sustainability bonds and sustainability loans. But that's only about 1/7 the size of the $730 billion global market. And I want us to think about that as a sense for headroom and a sense for how far this market can go. If the US, which is the world's biggest capital market, is still only 1/7 of the global total, you get a sense that there's a lot of appetite to keep driving this reset through capital here in the US. And finally, I want to talk technology. The cost of the lithium-ion storage battery is down 90% in the last 10 years. Other things are similar. Wind and solar have seen similar gains. And all of those things together, wrapping technology, capital, and companies together, is how we're really going to be able to build a reset that is fair, that is equitable, and that goes not just to agreements that we've made, but perhaps even beyond.
Up next, we have Sophie Purdom, co-founder of Climate Tech, and Akshat Rathi of Bloomberg, who'll talk about what's already working and what we can deploy tomorrow.
My name is Akshat Rathi and I'm a reporter with Bloomberg News. And with me I have Sophie Purdom, who's a climate tech investor and runs a popular newsletter called Climate Tech VC. 2020 was supposed to be the year of climate, but we all know what happened. Luckily, we now are facing into 2021, a year that could be the year of climate. And partly that's because we have in the White House a president who understands climate science. Joe Biden has promised to invest $1.7 trillion over the next 10 years in the clean energy space in the pursuit of creating 10 million jobs, jobs that we crucially need at a moment when there's an economic recession, but also jobs in a sector that we need to be able to meet climate goals. In 2020, one of the sectors that received a lot of attention is electric vehicles. Not just cars, but trucks and buses too. Sophie, what happened?
So much in electric vehicles in particular. And I have to say, one thing that rose to the top was the hype and excitement around this new vehicle called a SPAC. And now SPACs stand for Special Purpose Acquisition Companies. And they've been particularly popular in electric vehicles, in part because they allow electric vehicle companies to go public earlier. And so a SPAC is simply a shell company that will allow for the acquisition of a business without going through the labor intensive, cumbersome, slow IPO process. And so that means also that SPAC companies can talk about their future projected revenues in a way that traditional IPO candidates cannot. So aside from that financial lesson there, it's relevant for electric vehicles because, as we know, they're very capital intensive. And also they tend to be, at least in the US right now, pretty early in their maturation curve. And so 2020 has been enormous for electric vehicle SPACs. And so this is really a growth story that we've seen in particular focused on electric vehicles, where there's been an insurgence of interest from ESG investors looking to fund climate tech. And, Akshat, EVs don't work without batteries. And I'm wondering if you can provide perspective on that side of the equation. So where does the US stand on batteries now?
So the US is very good at innovating on batteries. It has, in the past and currently, some of the most advanced battery companies on the planet. But what it isn't very good at currently is taking those startups and making them build gigafactories. And that's what we are going to require if we are to build all the batteries that we need to power all the vehicles that Sophie talked about in the rush of companies promising these vehicles. And to do that, currently, most of the batteries being manufactured in the US are either South Korean, Japanese, or maybe in the future, Chinese. But someone like a Joe Biden will have to step in and provide certainty around demand for batteries, but also electric vehicles, so that investors feel comfortable investing the large sums needed to create these gigafactories. Now, switching topics a little bit, we talk about innovation, and that typically happens on the coast. But the US is a big country. What's happening in the middle when it comes to climate tech and climate goals?
In the heartland, a lot of the innovation is actually happening on the farms. And so 2020 was ripe for regenerative agriculture really booming. And you're right, we don't usually think about farms and innovation going hand in hand, but I would argue that farmers are inherently highly entrepreneurial and that this will be an area of focus over the next few years. And so regenerative agriculture is definitely poised to take off. And just to give you a sense of why this matters, right, about a quarter of all emissions are tied in some way to agriculture, either production or food wastage or spoilage or the inputs that go into growing food on the farm. This is an area of personal interest as I helped to build a company in this space, which is called Kula Bio. And at Kula, for example, we use microbes to produce a sustainable nitrogen fertilizer. Besides Kula and the microbial approach, some key technologies are really ready to scale up across the supply chain, transportation sector for agriculture, where food has to be shipped traditionally long distances, monitoring, reporting, input provision beyond fertilizer, including seeds, seed coatings, and then there's the other side of the chain of analytics, precision agriculture, sensors, microbiology, machinery. I'm excited about this space. There's a lot going on. Passion for agriculture, aside, I think there's no way that we can electrify tractors or power, hydrolysis to produce these microbes without a key input, and that key input being clean electricity. It's really the back of this, and this whole movement that we're calling climate tech. And so Biden set out this goal to make the grid carbon free by 2035. And I'm wondering your perspective on, is that even possible?
It's certainly a big challenge because no country, small or large, has made that commitment yet. Lots of countries have said they'll reach net zero emissions by 2050, which in itself is going to be very hard. But to clean up the grid all the way within 15 years is certainly going to be a challenge. What we do know is that wind and solar are now the cheapest sources of electricity. So even without much government intervention, these sources will grow and will grow rapidly. But of course, the grid has to supply electricity 24/7. People will need electricity whenever they turn on a button in their homes. And to do that, you're going to require a lot of innovation. You're going to have to rely on technologies that exist, so nuclear or geothermal, but also innovate on technologies that look hard right now but will be required, such as energy storage, not just in a battery, but over weeks and months. What we know is that scientists say getting to about 90% of electricity coming from carbon-free sources is doable within the 2035 timeframe. The last 10%, however, is going to be the hardest. And that's why we need innovation. Thanks for listening, and thank you, Sophie.
Up next, a story from someone who's making a change in their community.
Hi, I'm Danell Baird. I'm the CEO of Block Power. Block Power analyzes, finances, and project manages the installation of clean, smart, green, all-electric equipment in financially underserved communities. So at Block Power, we're making buildings smarter, greener, healthier, and more profitable. And we do that in urban communities and urban buildings. We take the fossil fuel equipment out of the buildings and we replace it with smart, green, healthy, all-electric equipment. So I was a community organizer and I did that for 3 years. Then I went to business school. And in one of my classes, we had the chairman and founder of a solar company show up. And he gave an amazing talk. And I was like, great, this is amazing. I'd love for you to install solar panels in Brownsville, Brooklyn, this neighborhood where I grew up. And he said, unfortunately, I think those people won't qualify for financing and solar from my company because their credit scores are going to be too low. We're just simply not able to provide solar to them. And I thought that was a shame. I mean, solar should be for everyone. And it turned out that the only way to make that happen was to start my own company. There's 105 million buildings across America. They produce 30% of America's greenhouse gas emissions. In order to reduce greenhouse gases across America, we have to green all the buildings. It's 2021 and all of the equipment that we install requires great internet connectivity. But in low-income communities, we often have to provide that internet connectivity. We think it's important to structure it as a co-op because we want community institutions to have ownership and control and governance over this new digital asset that we're installing on their roofs. And so by training and hiring Americans who need work, who are looking for employment, and giving them the skills to go building to building, and that aligns with our core mission of helping empower communities to access economic development through clean energy, through Wi-Fi, through creating jobs.
Aspen Ideas Reset is generously underwritten by MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, PayPal, and Prudential.
Up next, we will look at two big problems, climate change and the jobs crisis. Green jobs, of course, are the answer, but what will they look like and who will get them? Tina Smith tells us about the Senate's plan for climate policy in the year ahead.
Hello and welcome. I'm Aaron Rutkoff, the executive editor of Bloomberg Green, a magazine and digital publication covering climate and the energy transition at Bloomberg. I'm so glad today to be speaking with U.S. Senator Tina Smith of Minnesota. Senator Smith, you are a leader among Democrats on climate policy and energy, and right now we are seeing in Texas for the second time in less than a year a situation where there's a lot of deeply misleading attempts to blame renewable energy for blackouts and infrastructure problems. Last summer that happened also in California. Why do you think we're seeing people like the governor of Texas and some of your colleagues in Congress rushing to pin the blame on green energy?
Well, I think this is part of what has been a long strategy to politicize and kind of siphon the facts and the science and the data out of efforts to address climate change. You know, what's happening in Texas, first of all, is tragic. We've had a significant loss of life. We have people that are literally boiling their water because water systems are failing in big cities around the state. And the reason that this is happening has nothing to do with renewable energy in Texas. In fact, renewable energy is, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of only 10% of the energy, makes only about a 10% contribution to the energy in Texas. It has to do with the failure of fossil fuel, especially natural gas. And why has that failed? Because of a complete failure to weatherize the natural gas system for extreme weather events. And, you know, we know that we're going to be seeing more extreme weather events rather than fewer of them. So this is entirely predictable. And in fact, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission warned Texas about this 10 years ago when there was another big crisis. So the opportunity to move forward on clean energy is an opportunity that we have to seize in this moment.
You know, looking at the kind of backlash that we've seen against wind turbines in the Texas story, it struck me to look up that Minnesota itself it has a large amount of wind power happening, and the state's obviously far colder than Texas. So, I mean, that goes to your point about weatherization and these being things we can prevent. I know you've been a part of attempts in the Senate to steer resources towards green energy standards for the country. Is it your sense that this is something where we can make progress rapidly, or given the kind of vulnerability of the infrastructure, are people going to be stuck in situations like this as climate change brings more extreme weather about?
Well, you know, you're talking about wind energy in Minnesota. Minnesota is a powerful wind energy state, and our wind energy has been functioning very well, even though Minnesota temperatures have barely broken zero over the last 10 days. And that's because we have our wind turbines weatherized. So the thing that I think we have to focus on is that we are at a turning point in terms of both the policy, in terms of the technology, and also in terms of the politics when it comes to clean energy. We are seeing dramatic cost curve declines in renewable energy. We are seeing a much higher acceptance, for example, in rural parts of my state for wind energy because it augments farm incomes. And the politics of this are changing as well, especially as we, with the President Biden, focus on how moving forward on clean energy can be good for costs, can be good for jobs, can be good for our country's competitiveness, and it can be good for our health.
Well, I want to ask you about that turning point because I know in 2019 you put together legislation on national clean energy standards, and then the Biden election happens, and we see the goal get even bigger than what you tried to do in 2019, right? So now we're looking at Biden's attempt to have 100% clean electricity grid in the United States by 2035. Can you talk to me about that change over the last 2 years and what you think is possible now in the Senate?
Yeah. Well, for really, decades, that discussion, the debate, the political debate around clean energy has been around, on the one hand, sort of saying that you can't move too quickly because you're going to have high costs, you're going to lose jobs, it's going to be countered, people are going to have to make massive sacrifices in their personal consumption patterns, versus like, we have to do this or we're all going to die. I mean, it's been a stalemated conversation. And I believe that that is changing. And in order to really push the change through with the work that President Biden and Vice President Harris are doing, and the work that we want to do in the Senate, is to focus on how we can do this in a way that expands job opportunities and expands our competitiveness. You take a senator like Joe Manchin, who is a very important senator in the Senate now because he heads the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and because he represents a state that has basically produced the coal that has made the lights go on and the power, the heating go on for people in this country for 100 years. You can't just say to Joe Manchin, oh, you all just have to change. You got to figure out a place-based strategy for how his state can be competitive and his workers can have great jobs in order to be successful.
I know there's been a big emphasis with the arrival of the Biden administration on an idea not just of jobs for people who are pushed out of old fossil fuel industries by this transition, but of a bipartisan approach to some of these issues. Do you see there being a middle ground? What does a bipartisanship on climate and clean energy legislation look like right now?
Well, look, I'm not naive about this. This is going to be complicated and it's going to be difficult. And I say this without trying to be partisan about it, that the Republican Party is actually, over the last decade or so, has moved away in many regards from being supportive of moving towards a clean energy future. But there are glimmers of opportunity, and I think we have to seize them. In the last legislative session, I was successful in working with Republican colleagues to pass some important pieces of clean energy legislation to expand battery storage and research into energy, wind energy. So yeah, I think you have to build out from that. But I think that making progress on a clean electricity standard, for example, making progress on improving our electric grid so that it has the resilience and the reliability that we need with renewables, as well as with what's happening in Texas. That's going to be hard work, and the coalition isn't built yet, but we're in the progress of building it right now.
I don't want to go too deep in the weeds of the mechanics of getting stuff passed, but if it proves to be the case that there aren't 60 votes there, do you feel like it's necessary in order to address climate to go around or do away with the filibuster, if that's what's standing in the way of a very meaningful climate legislation?
One of the things that we're working on right now is how this process that's called the reconciliation process could also be used as a way of moving clean energy forward. As we think about a large infrastructure and clean energy package, which I expect we'll start working on in the Senate later in March, reconciliation, that process, which only requires a majority vote in the Senate, is an important option for us.
And now, if we're thinking ahead to 4 years from now, how do you judge success? I mean, I know the mantra from the president and the vice president is that climate is jobs. So are you measuring success based on creating jobs around clean energy? Is it something where you're looking at particular climate metrics to see whether we're on a path towards progress? How do you judge, basically, if we're moving in the right direction?
Well, the metric for progress is how we are doing at decarbonizing our economy. And I say that we should start with decarbonizing the electric system, which is a big contributor to carbon pollution in our atmosphere. So to me, that's the core metric. How are we doing at getting carbon out of our power system? And we have to do that in a way that is creating jobs and creating opportunities, especially in the places that have been hardest hit by the transition. And I would say especially in the communities that have felt the greatest harm from air pollution from fossil fuels.
Well, I think after what we've seen in Texas in the past week, probably a lot more people now are thinking about the grid than were before. Thank you so much for being with us today and walking us through all this.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Later today, we'll have a chance to talk more globally, and we mean that literally. After 4 years of isolationist policies, the US has begun to look outward again. The old issues are still there: the rise of China, growing global income inequality, fractured trade relations, and the pandemic has underscored just how interdependent we really are. Starting at 3 p.m. Eastern today, we'll take a hard look at the US's international approach and hear some great ideas for resetting our standing in the world. But first, join us for 2 interactive breakouts. We've already got a lot of tools that can move us to a net zero economy, but which ones will get us there fastest? Andrew Jones of Climate Interactive can tell us using his firm's Smart Simulator. Tune in and see which technologies we should plug in. Then, the carbon economy is a problem, and capitalism is to blame, or maybe a particular version of capitalism is to blame. Mariana Mazzucato is a researcher who understands how much businesses owe to government research and support, and to society. Rethinking capitalism to be inclusive, sustainable, and innovative could help us solve the really big problems. Stephanie Flanders of Bloomberg Economics will talk with Mazzucato about her book, Mission Economy: A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. No registration required to join these live interactive breakouts. Just check your email for the links or follow the directions on your screen. After those sessions, we'll see you right here at 3 p.m. Eastern.